Good morning. How's everyone doing this morning? Very good. Thank you all for being here. This is a symposium, but it's also a celebration. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and a very proud affiliate faculty member of African American Studies program. We're using this event, and you've heard it, and I will repeat it, to ramp up to eventually become a department where we will be able to grant advanced graduate degrees, master's degrees, and PhD degrees in African American Studies. That's what we're doing. So before I start my formal remarks, I've been asked by the staff to just give a few reminders, some logistics. Lunch will be served after this panel. We'll hold our questions until the very end, but we are providing lunch today for everyone. So we want you to stick around, engage in a dialogue with us about where we want to take our African American Studies program in our next steps. Also, we have a shuttle that's running on a regular loop, and it's if you want to know where to pick up the shuttle, just walk out the door here and talk to any staff, and it's just right down the covered walkway, but just talk to a staff member, and there's a shuttle that will take you back to the parking area when you need to exit the premises. We also have been asked to remember, we have some wonderful authors here this morning who have, in some cases, traveled here to bring their books. They have their books on display, both colleagues here on campus and distinguished authors like Dr. Levon Bracey, Mr. Philemon Wright, Mr. Albert White, who have their books, and they're out there and would love to sign a book for you. So, and I also want to begin by thanking the amazing staff, leadership, colleagues at George Smathers Libraries. And Dean Russell, I take this opportunity anytime I have the lectern to really brag about how amazing this library system is. I was an anonymous graduate student in the 1990s at Duke University, and I came down here. I didn't have any titles, any kind of so-called degrees by my name, and the staff really adopted me. And I'm talking about people like Bruce Chappell, people like Joel Buchanan, people like Carl Van Ness, who's here. Thank you, Carl. And these were staff who took me really literally under their wing, helped me figure out what kind of research I needed to do to write a dissertation on African American history. Also, please take some time to check out the library staff put together a wonderful exhibit, a book exhibit over here with wonderful photographs. So please take some time to check that out. So I was asked this morning to talk about the role of oral history in African American studies. And that role is very profound. Now, I'm not going to read any of these slides, but I'm going to ask the audience this morning to kind of multitask and just start reading through this as I'm speaking, and I'll explain to you what you're reading as you kind of read through it, because this is one demonstration about the centrality and the importance of African American studies and the intersection of oral history and African American studies. To echo what my colleague, Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, has just educated us with, African American studies really opens the gateway for other scholars, for new people to make it into the academy. I'm so grateful as a first-generation Chicano Mexican-American scholar, I would not have had the opportunity to enter a university like Duke if it wasn't for my ancestors and peers who preceded me in African American studies to create African American studies departments and programs that, again, paved the way for Chicano studies, for women's studies, for labor studies. So I'm eternally grateful for the pioneering work of African American studies in opening the door both intellectually but also personally to students of color, to faculty of color like myself. Now, let me also brag a moment on African American Studies program here. And I'm going to brag by saying that, and again, echoing what Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn just said, I want us to really think about the significance of being one of the fastest growing majors at the University of Florida. because everywhere I go, and in the past year with my most recent book in African American and Latinx history of the United States, I've lectured at Harvard, New York University, UC Berkeley, UCLA, many of these other off-time universities, right? None of them are as good as us. None of them are as good as Gainesville or the University of Florida. But everywhere I go, I mention, you know, we have over 100 majors in our African American Studies program. And Dean Shaw, the folks at Harvard say, no way, we have less than half of that. The people at Berkeley are like, how can you have that many? We can't get any more than 25 or 30. Now, don't tell them I said that, right? But I just want to brag for a moment on the incredible love and passion that our staff and faculty have in building the major. So I have about 10 minutes left, and I want to talk about this role of oral history and African American studies. And so you've had a chance to look over this. What oral history does is it fills in the blanks. And if you look at the description of Dr. W.S. Stevens, this is an official, literally, as Florida State or a state-centered description of this remarkable gentleman. And in class, we would do a Q&A. Students, we would do a quiz, by the way, after this. But I'm not going to hold you to that. But check it out. This is a state description of an African-American doctor who is one of the most distinguished doctors in the entire state of Florida. And this description gives us a lot of really good information about him. But it also leaves a lot of information out. And this is where oral history comes in, because I was able to interview several family members and people who knew Dr. W.S. Stevens very well. And there's a lot of information here. If you know anything about the period of legal segregation and the African American freedom struggle in the Deep South in Florida, Florida state is a state, by the way, Florida had the highest per capita lynching rate in the entire country. Higher than Georgia, higher than Mississippi, higher than Alabama. So there's a lot of good information here about Dr. Stevens, but a lot is left out. A lot of questions you would ask about him. And this is what oral history helped to fill in for me. One of the things, and you'll see I bolded this, and I can give you this presentation if you can't read it, but one of the things I discovered was Dr. Stevens was always politically active. He was involved in registering African Americans to register to vote in the 20s. If you were African American and you tried to register to vote almost anywhere in the state, it was a life-threatening decision. But this was a man who promoted black political empowerment. He promoted black business excellence. And he built a hospital, a black-owned hospital in Quincy, which the white medical establishment burned to the ground, because they didn't want a black doctor having an independent, black-owned hospital. These are all things I learned through archival research and interviewing people about this remarkable individual. But all of this information that you see here is not on the official state description of him. They missed it. We'll just be charitable. They forgot to put it in. But oral history allows us to fill in a lot of these gaps, especially when we're studying people who have been historically oppressed, enslaved people. The next example is that in the 1930s, historians like myself and all of us are so thankful and grateful for the work of people like Zora Neale Hurston, Stetson Kennedy. During the 1930s, the federal government, the New Deal's Work Progress Administration, created the Federal Writers Project. For 2 amazing years, journalists, many of them African Americans, fanned out throughout the South and conducted oral history interviews with people who had been enslaved. And those interviews became part of the renaissance and resurgence of African American studies in the 1960s and 70s. And if you look at the book on the far right, my far right, probably your John Blassingame's The Slave Community, that book was published in the late 60s, initially in early format as a dissertation, and has been republished many times. But a lot of that scholarship, you see The Florida Slave, Remembering Slavery, all of these books published in the 80s or later rest upon that oral history work that was done in the 1930s. In the 1960s, in 1967, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program was started. And I mentioned earlier the role of African American studies in opening the door to area studies programs, to oral history programs. And oral history programs, all of our programs had a very tight connection to African American studies. And those of you who don't know will soon know the name of Mr. Joel Buchanan. He's a great example. So Joel Buchanan, yes. Joel Buchanan was the person who worked here as a librarian for many years. He was also one of the first African-American students to integrate Gainesville High School, a longtime leader of the NAACP, a great historian, and worked closely with our founder, Dr. Samuel Proctor, to start an African-American oral history project in the early 1980s. So I just want, again, to emphasize the intersectionality of oral history and African-American studies. This journal, by the way, Southern Exposure, reminds us that oral history and African-American studies came out of activism, of struggle. Social movement scholars like Jacqueline Dowd Hall, who founded the UNC Oral History Program, had been a movement activist in the women's movement, in the anti-war movement. Dr. Samuel Proctor, our founder, was one of the first UF faculty to sign an open statement in support of integration in downtown Gainesville, one of only 5 faculty members to do that. So oral history has always been intersecting with African American studies, social movements, and so on and so forth. Now I want to brag a little bit about the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. We have had a close relationship and a blessed relationship with African American studies from day one. And you have, one of the things we've handed out is our public program booklet. So oral history the UF way means we do community-based oral history work. Again, we borrow from the traditions of African American studies, which is that it's great to have university seminars, it's great to do dissertation research, it's great to have programs on campus, but unless we're interacting with the community in a reciprocal manner, then we're not really doing the job that we're supposed to be doing. That was the tradition that African American studies started. So in your booklet, you'll see a number of different public programs. You'll see a gentleman sitting here, many of you know, Attorney John Dorsey Dew, a legend in the Florida civil rights movement with his wife, Patricia Stevens Dew. That was one of our most favorite public programs, Evening with the Dews. It was in 2011. I'm so happy to be able to report to you today that officially Attorney John Dorsey Dew will be awarded an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Florida this spring commencement. I think I'm supposed to wrap up here, but I'll just commend you again to the booklet, and you'll see testimony from students who went out on field study projects through the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and African American Studies, because if you look at Brianne Palmer, I'm pretty sure that Brianne Palmer was an African American Studies major and took a lot of courses. I'm seeing Dr. Tricia nod her head. So Brianne Palmer was one of the many students who we took to the Mississippi Delta to interview veterans of the civil rights movement and the black freedom struggle in the Delta. And she credits that trip talking directly to people like Attorney Dew, to longtime freedom fighters in the Mississippi Delta, both people who have been attorneys, but local grassroots organizers, did voter registration, equal education struggles. Brianne credits that experience of being able to talk directly to African American elders, of putting her on a moral and intellectual path to law school and to really do this amazing work she's doing now. She's become one of the foremost rising young attorneys in immigration rights in this country. And it was African American studies and oral history which really helped her to take that path. So as I kind of wrap up, again, Joel Buchanan is a name I want to really lift up. And my colleague Stephanie Birch is going to talk a little more about this later in the panel. But Joel Buchanan was, again, the person who really worked with Dr. Proctor in the early 1980s to do interviews with African Americans in Gainesville. And then when I arrived here as the new director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, one of the first people to welcome me again into the Gainesville community was Joel Buchanan. And what Joel told me was, Paul, we really need to ramp up our collections. Let's open a big archive in African American history. Let's do as many oral histories as we can. I'm so thrilled to tell you now that we have 1,000+ oral history interviews in this collection. Again, thanks to the collaboration of African American Studies faculty, library staff, Samuel Proctor Oral History Program students. This collection, by the way, is becoming incredibly highly used, not only by students here, high school students, university students, but scholars and students all across the country now are using the Joel Buchanan African American Oral History Archive. I will close here by returning to the theme I began with. What does oral history give us? What does it provide intellectually in a scholarly way? In my research, in my books, probably 75% of my research is archival research. But the 25%, that's the oral history part, to me is probably the most important. And the story of Oscar Mack just highlights that. So the Ballad of Oscar Mack is a reference to a gentleman who, in the early 1920s, was targeted for lynching because he received a job, he earned a job in the post office near Kissimmee, Florida, which was a very high-paying position. And the Ku Klux Klan went to literally take him out because a black man was not supposed to hold such a good job in the post office in Kissimmee, Florida in 1923. And so the story was that he had been lynched in 1923. And so the oral history program worked with colleagues at Rollins College, which is closer to the area, to do oral histories about this horrific incident. One day, we received a call, and the call came from a gentleman by the name of James Brown, who lived in Lithonia, Georgia. Not James Brown, the singer, but James Brown actually worked for the juvenile justice program there. And he called and he said, you know, I really appreciate you highlighting the story of my great-grandfather, but here's something you don't know. My great-grandfather, the Klan tried to lynch him, but he escaped. And he lived out the rest of his life in the North, on the run from the Ku Klux Klan. And so you can imagine getting a call like this. And so we immediately flew up to Akron and began interviewing family members. He was so afraid of being caught by the Klan that even when he was buried under an assumed name, right? But oral history, working collaboratively with African American studies colleagues, with oral historians, was able to kind of tell the story, to talk about his struggles. 2 years ago, we were invited out to take part in a rededication of his tombstone. And so for the first time ever, there's a new tombstone at his grave which actually lists his real name. Okay, so thank you so much, and we're excited to take part in our Q&A later.
Good afternoon. I know there's a little bit of a shuffle. I actually want to dedicate my little 15, let me time myself to self-managed, I'll be managed, right? To students. And so part of what's been great about coming back here as an alum is I get to go to school every day and look at the younger versions of myself looking back. And it's been quite a transformational experience. So and also there's some who have an exam, so I give them exam answers written in the talk. So here we go. So I titled this Looking Back and Marching Forward. In other words, listen to Black women. I was hired to study race and gender and Black feminism, so enjoy. And hi, Dr. Pui. It's so weird. Like, I know I'm faculty, but like there's some of you who are my mentors. It's cool. Okay. So we are named very different things. We are called different things. We are called African American Studies here. We are called Africana Studies. We are called African Diaspora Studies. We're also called Black Studies. And so I will use the words interchangeably, but I call us Black Studies in my mind, and also to mark my own political trajectory. In the past few years, I've had the pleasure of teaching young people who helped me to stretch my own understanding of the already highly interdisciplinary and critical space from which I do my work. And as a media scholar, specifically as a Black feminist media scholar, I'm deeply invested in exploring how Black people are represented and how we represent ourselves. As we march forward, the way we fashion ourselves must involve revolutionary love, revolutionary care, and the revolutionary act of seeing each other in all of our humanity. So when I teach classes, I think I'm the most serious professor on campus because I teach history in like 3 sentences. And I often say, one of the okey dokes or the tricks or the achievements of the project of colonization is the erasure of our histories, cultures, religions, languages, and contributions to the world. It was a project, it is a project that depended on and depends on distorting our self-perceptions and perceptions of us by others. The work of Black studies, Latino, Latina, Latinx studies, Asian American studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, and other iterations of ethnic studies is to address and redress these erasures and distortions. So let me frame a bit of what's going to happen moving forward by reaching way back, not that far back, all the way to Orlando, or Orlando area, right? I know, 407. When asked about how she felt about racism and exclusion, Florida native Zora Neale Hurston said, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company is beyond me." We know that feeling. Hurston is instructive in crafting our future as a field. First, she was committed to exploring the everydayness of Black people's lives, the sounds we made, the cadences in our speech, our complex interpersonal relationships, and our varied religions. Her anthropology of everyday Black life and literature reflects the everyday that in a way that she was not trying to prove that we were human. She was not trying to demonstrate our humanity. She was not trying to convince people that we were worthy of citizenship, but she worked to help us recognize ourselves in her work. She extends the humanist vision that our being was enough. Our being was enough to make us worthy of citizenship and freedom. It is the tradition of, this is the same tradition of Toni Morrison, who writes for us, and Edwidge Dunticott, who writes for us, and many others. Second, Hurston deeply understood the importance of Black transnationalism. She wrote her award-winning book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, who everybody has read, right? If you haven't read it for your whole lives. She writes this book in my home, Haiti. She traveled the world in small-town USA to study us. She was able to see Black culture and Black brilliance. She saw brilliance in our music, in our art, in our religion. And so I'll continue this presentation inspired by Hurston's work on the brilliance of Blackness and on the brilliance of Black studies. And I sent you this using a handful of scholars, some of who are from here and work here, others who are just phenomenal, and some of whom have come here to visit us. And so I do this as a part of our celebration of this global, noble, and ever so urgent project of Black studies. Writing about a moment where Haiti and Charleston, South Carolina seemed to collide in headlines, anthropologist and performance studies scholar Gina Athena Ulysse writes, "The Haitian Revolution disturbed the notion that freedom with a capital F was the sole domain of whites and those close to whiteness. Indeed, the value ascribed to those Black lives continued to deteriorate. Moreover, those among us who are visibly marked with that Blackness have had to continually dissuade folks that we are not genetically coded to be property or the help." This is not limited to Haiti, but is symptomatic of a greater Black diaspora struggle as we continue, as continuous state-sanctioned and market-driven violence on Black bodies attest here and elsewhere. So Ulysse cites Peter, who has a hard name, Haviland Edua, who writes on Twitter. And this is after the shooting in the church in South Carolina, right? And so the person writes, "We can't swim, we can't buy Skittles, we can't listen to loud music, we can't shop, we can't play, we can't breathe, we can't pray." Ulysse continues, "There are no safe spaces for that Black. 9 people were killed in their place of worship, an act of terrorism that must be named. Their killers sat in a pew for an hour before extinguishing their Black lives." As I've argued elsewhere, I write a piece about representations of Black death. Black death is often served as entertainment. I'm going to cite myself. Black death and pain, it's important to do that too. Black death and pain have long entertained some Americans, as evidenced by postcards of lynching and lynching picnics, along with countless examples throughout U.S. history. Today's particular version is aided by rapidly evolving technology, the ability to share materials instantaneously on social media. Oh, I lost it. For different reasons. While scholars look back on lynching as a spectacle, today's Black murder may be theorized as ritual. One can partake in it as a regular scheduled program or binge watch. So thinking about all of the police procedural shows and reality TV dramas that focus on Black death, where you can watch it for days at a time, right? And so Hurston and Ulysse remind us that the future of Black studies requires serious transnational solidarity. Faye Harrison's scholarship, some of you are like, yes, we know her. As someone who has worked diligently in transforming the field of anthropology, and also, of course, she does really great work in Caribbean studies, is also informative in that she, years ago, urged us to prepare for this contemporary moment. She gives us a directive to those of us who are working for a more just world. She says, "Anti-racist activism must be attentive to the working of complicit forms of individual and collective agency with their political, economic, and psychological dimensions. A holistic understanding of the dynamics of culture, power, and political economy at multiple levels, local, national, transnational, within a global matrix of domination is needed to craft a better means of coalition building." So specifically, Harrison urges us to understand health disparities, health outcomes within a broader global context, a context which has large countries, large organizations dictating what kinds of healthcare is provided for other smaller countries through this idea of funding and donor relationships. Harrison reminds us that the future of Black studies requires a sharpening critique of global processes. Stephanie Evans' research not only brings forward Black women's contribution as knowledge producers in writing about the first documented Black women in universities, but she also challenges the idea that we must die in the ivory tower. Her work on mental health, and I say I'm not going to die here, okay? Her work on mental health, and most recently her uncovering of Black women leaders practicing health practices, including yoga, gives us a roadmap on how to continue this work. Our survival and wellness are also resistance. Dr. Evelyn Alexis, historian, urges us to study Black women's politics within the context of the social and political context of the time. Her work on Shirley Chisholm, we know Shirley Chisholm? Yeah. All right. Her work highlights Chisholm's historical and contemporary media erasure as the first woman running for president on a major party ticket. It was not Hillary. The first Black person running on a major party ticket, it was not Barack. And as the first Black woman elected to U.S. Congress, Chisholm also took an unwavering fight for the working class and poor people's rights, including access to reproductive rights and also health care for all. Alexis works also on the resistance to U.S. military occupation in Haiti, and she traces the many ways that women were central to the resistance and have always been freedom fighters. There's a way that we get erased as freedom fighters in history, which is fascinating. And so despite this erasure, she reminds us that this is who we have always been. Alexis and others remind us that Black studies must also be intersectional and pay attention to class and gender politics. Daphne Brooks writes about Beyonce and many others, and Mary J. Blige. I have photos just for some of you Beehive people. And so she suggests that we look closely at the musical performance of Beyonce as well as Blige, as each artist's work creates a particular kind of Black feminist surrogation that is an embodied performance that recycles palpable forms of Black female social-political grief and loss, as well as a spirited dissent and dissonance. Dr. Joseph reminds us that transcending or moving beyond Blackness should not be the goal. Instead, she argues that the popularity of post-racial ideology, this idea that we have achieved racial equality and we don't need to fight racism anymore, we can laugh about that now, but that was a thing people were doing. She said this idea is what ushered us into this new era where overt racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia are again the norm. And I want to add that more than new or the return of norm, these have intensified. Almost there. I'm going to go a little bit over. Sorry. Dr. Durham also recognizes the importance of the idea of home and home place. She reminds us that some Black women navigating academia find ourselves positioned as outsiders and insiders within, citing Patricia Hill Collins. Some of us like, yes. Some of us, yes. We know the feeling. And also in our own communities. And so she asks us to take seriously the interventions of Black women in hip hop who help us imagine an alternative future through this idea of Afrofuturism. And so I bring together all of these scholars as they offer Black studies present in a future that is necessary to help move us forward. And so at 50 plus years across the country, scholars have taken up this work in very different ways. At our best, we are taking very seriously the Black feminist theorization of intersectionality. There's a way of erasing Black feminists from our own theories. It is the Black feminist theory of intersectionality. Paying attention to the ways that racial oppression must be critiqued and analyzed alongside class, gendered, and sexualized oppression. Our research must increasingly take up ability and disability, trans identities, health disparities, and immigration. Xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments and legislation must be at the forefront of our work and activism today. Those who came before us were deeply concerned with immigration and workers' rights. Looking beyond 50, we have the opportunity to be bold and to once again pivot, taking with us what we learned from the past 50 years. And so one of the people who you should, for your whole lives, get to know is Audre Lorde, and I actually we'll end with her. And she writes this poem on the litany of survival. And she says, and when we speak, we are not afraid. Our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So Audre Lorde says we weren't meant to survive. Tupac says we weren't meant to survive. Speaking of women, working class communities, and poor communities of color, but they each give us a way out. And one of the ways to do this is through this idea of radical love and self-love. The word self-love can be deceiving. Self functions in community. If you must kill your own people, reflections of yourselves and parts of yourselves in order to survive, none of us will survive. One of the most, and in other words, this says, if we are not all free, none of us is free, right? And so one of the most important sentences that I learned as a student 20 years ago, pledging, which technically was illegal, actually it wasn't. What was it, 20 years ago? I am my sister's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. Sorority life. Anybody Greek life? Yeah, we know the poem. You know the poem? Love is a powerful response to colonization. This decolonial love includes searching for and writing about all that was erased, stolen, or distorted. This decolonial love requires that we see all parts of ourselves, that we understand that Blackness is global. Blackness is multilingual. It includes, among others, Spanish, Portuguese, Swahili, Akan, Yoruba, Creole, Patois, English, poetry, hip-hop, R&B love songs. Blackness is multinational and includes, among others, African American, Mexican, Nigerian, Colombian, Cuban, German, Ethiopian, English, Jamaican, Puerto Rican, Dutch, French, Japanese, Ghanaian. Blackness exists between the fabricated borders of nation states. Nations are not real. They weren't real. Blackness is diverse across class, gender, sexuality, religion. The future of Blackness is radical as we work to see, uncover, witness, pass down, document, and reimagine ourselves, carrying forward what centuries of colonization could not erase. Blackness is alive. Black studies is alive. That is revolutionary. And so across the country, as we are all celebrating 50+ years, I will go back to Audre Lorde, because she said 50 years ago, these people were afraid and they spoke anyways, and that's why we're here. And so as we move forward for the next 50 years, even when we are afraid, we must speak so that we can continue to exist. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I can't raise it up anymore. So my name is Stephanie Birch, and I'm the African American Studies librarian here at the University of Florida. I've been asked to speak about the status of the library's African American collections, but in order to do that, it is important to look back on the development of these collections and to acknowledge the skillful stewardship of the many past and present library workers involved. But before I get to that, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the display cases along the back of the room, which showcase only a portion of the intellectual contributions of African American Studies faculty and affiliated scholars at the University of Florida over the past 50 years. These materials were gathered from collections across the university library system, including education, Latin American and Caribbean studies, special collections, Library West, and the Legal Information Resource Center, Legal Information Center. When you have a moment today, please do browse those cases. As we look back over the past 50 years, the library has a lot to tell us about the changing academic, social, and political climate of the university and society at large, as well as the development of African American studies as a field of study, as a discipline. With the advent of the African American Studies program in 1969, the libraries began to build its collection to support the burgeoning area of study. According to a survey of holdings from 1974, the UF Library's African American collections consisted of then current monographs and scholarly publications on Black music, theater, and literature, with an emphasis on Black popular culture and specifically representations, or reflections rather, of the Harlem Renaissance. At this time, the collections prioritized humanities research, but did include some major social science publications. So some of the major microfilm acquisitions of the time were from the Schomburg collections, as well as long-standing newspapers from Detroit and Baltimore, and several radical Black newspapers. Over the years, the microfilm collections has grown to include the papers of the NAACP, FBI surveillance files of African American leaders, and the papers of Frederick Douglass. According to university historian Carl Van Ness, who is somewhere in this room, I believe, during the night, During the 1970s, library workers transferred African American studies materials from the circulating collection to rare books. The apparent reason for this transfer was that the library workers feared that these materials would be intentionally defaced or destroyed. Some of these titles remain in the rare books collection today and are now considered to be just that, rare books. This should remind us that libraries are not neutral spaces. Even today, public and academic libraries deal with issues for the requesting of banned books, which are often works by authors on the fringe, people of color, as well as even the intentional hiding of or the misplacement of books to prevent people from being able to find them in the stacks. In the early 2000s, the libraries gained significant momentum to further develop the African American Special Collections holdings. This effort was spearheaded by Joelle Buchanan, who worked for the Special Collections Department from 2004 to 2010. Joelle cultivated relationships with local community members and organizations to ensure the preservation of Gainesville's African American histories and archival materials. In addition to his leadership in collection development, Joelle also supported African American Studies faculty and students through research assistance, lectures, and public programs. Today, the libraries host a digital archive of African American oral histories in his honor. The archive is comprised of recordings and transcripts from the Sam Proctor Oral History Program. His work with the program in the 80s to record interviews from local African American residents laid the foundation for this vast collection that exists today, which to date contains over 1,000 interviews. After 2010, Janice Ronan served as the library's liaison to the African American Studies program. Her work contributed to the development of a robust interdisciplinary circulating collection, which means the ones you can check out, which was largely concentrated in Library West. Today, the library's African American general collection is dispersed across each of the university libraries, with broad support from collection managers and selectors in the fields of art and architecture, education, the sciences and health sciences, and law. Both Joelle and Jana played an instrumental role in the development of the library's African American holdings in accordance with the university's evolving curricular and scholarly needs. Following the establishment, well, actually, and I have to say that, thank you, Dr. Hillier-Nunn. I have the date wrong here. It should be 2015 for the first awarded bachelor's degree programs. So I'll just recognize that, thank you. So following the establishment of the African American Studies bachelor's degree program, my position was created. And in 2016, I came to the University of Florida as the African American Studies librarian to provide discipline-specific research assistance, collection development, and library instruction. As a librarian, I wear many hats from one day to the next. In my nearly 4 years here, I have focused much of my energy on developing students' information literacy skills in two key ways. First, through instruction sessions with African American Studies and cross-listed courses. Using student-centered pedagogies, my instruction sessions aim to bolster students' confidence in their abilities to navigate the research process and produce high-quality, independent scholarship. And secondly, through one-on-one research consultations with African American Studies students, in which I engage them as experts in their own learning and personal and professional development. During consultation sessions, students are able to workshop their ideas and receive individualized assistance in crafting and executing their research assignments. So while I operate as the library's liaison to the African American Studies program, much of my work is performed in close collaboration with my library colleagues across campus and is driven by the interdisciplinary scholarship and instruction offered at the University of Florida. My primary collaborator is Florence Turcott, who I also believe is somewhere in the room. Right back there. And she is the Literary Collections Archivist and also serves as the library's African American, LGBTQ, and Women's Studies Special Collections Archivist. During her tenure, Florence has contributed to several major African American acquisitions projects, including the Bo Diddley and James Haskins collections and the Zora Neale Hurston papers. Under her careful stewardship, the African American Special Collections safeguards over 300 linear feet of archival materials and objects, organized into over 650 boxes. Included within these collections are numerous vulnerable and unique materials documenting African American communities and experiences in Florida. Together, Florence and I collaborate broadly across the university library system. How broad, do you ask? Well, here are a list of a few of our internal partners working out front and behind the scenes. I hope this gives you a sense of how many library faculty and staff contribute their skills, expertise, and time to African American studies related projects. So here are a few highlights. 2018 was a busy year for African American studies related exhibits, addressing themes like race and representation in children's literature and the activism of Black educators in the Jim Crow period. Additionally, librarians stepped in as key partners in all 4 of the Mellon-funded Intersections grant projects awarded by the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. Listed here are 2 of the most relevant projects, one on Black and Latinx global identities, and 2 of my panelists, fellow panelists are on that project. And the other is Imagining a Future Without Mass Incarceration. Last year, we celebrated the unveiling of the Joel Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History, and this involved a total overhaul of the digital collection structure and updates to the descriptive records, which is how you're able to search and access materials within the collection. Over the summer, the libraries hosted a 2-day collaborative workshop to support the development of community-led digital projects on Black history in Florida. And in the fall semester, the university archives acquired the Black Student Union papers. But perhaps the library's most notable accomplishment of 2019 was the acquisition and exhibition of the Bo Diddley collection. And some of those pieces are available to see over here at the special collections table. So do check that out as well. In 2020, our work continues. Next month, the Health Science Center Library will open an exhibit on the relationship between food, power, and slavery in America. This exhibit is on loan from the National Library of Medicine and will be on view through April 11th. Additionally, there are 2 Black newspaper digitization projects underway. One of those projects focuses on digitizing print issues from the Burning Spear, which is the oldest Black Power newspaper in existence, published without interruption since 1960s. As you can see, our libraries are working hard to support the African American Studies program. In the next 50 years, the libraries will remain a key partner in the advancement of African American studies research and instruction at the University of Florida. Through our collections, the libraries offers continued support for interdisciplinary faculty and the growing number of African American studies students as the program continues forward in its transition to a department. A few key actionable goals are to increase the representation of Black scholarly voices within the general collection, to further diversify special collections holdings with a special interest in community service organizations, including Black Greek societies, and to enhance the visibility of the library collection and resources through exhibitions, public programs, and digital initiatives. And lastly, to collaborate strategically with off-campus partners to support the development of community-led archives. In closing, I'd like to draw your attention back to the display along the back of the room. A majority of these cases represent the scholarly contributions of UF faculty, both past and present. But the center case, which is right in front of me, is a little bit different. It represents the work that is to come. Within this case lie our collective hopes and aspirations for the future of the African American Studies program, or African American Studies, one day to be a department, at the University of Florida. Today, as we close the chapter on these first 50 years, why don't you say we make the next one a real page turner? That's a library joke. I am grateful for the opportunity to be a part of the history of African American Studies at UF, and I look forward to taking the next leg of this journey together. Thanks.
Give me some light, please. Let there be light. Oh, thank you. How do you all feel so far? Come on, tell them. Tell them. Feel good. This is fantastic. How many of you would like to see what is presented here published as a volume? Let me see your hand. There we go. I told them. We're not just talking. This is going to be the volume. It's publishable. Now we come to a very exciting part of the discussion, questions and answers. If you want, who has the first question, if you want to make comments, please be brief. You have a question? Please. Here we go. I get it, baby.
Stephanie, I know you have enough projects to keep you busy for a couple of weeks. Is there any effort being made to digitize local Black mortuary records? Anybody who's done genealogy work realizes there's a wealth of information in mortuary records. And a lot of it is just written down on paper.
Thank you.
Do we have a comment from over here?
Is there any comment?
In response to that, yeah.
Okay. Here we go.
I just want to say I remember when Joel Buchanan was alive and we came over here and Hale Funeral Home and one other funeral home gave a huge collection of information about families and everything to this library. Leslie Cosby, Dr. Cosby gave his collection of information, so it's here somewhere.
Okay.
We do, so yes, we do have the Cosby collection, and Flo may be able to provide some more information on that, as well as, it's not Gainesville, but Ocala, the Cunningham Funeral Home. And as far as digitization efforts, past or future, maybe you can comment.
The Cunningham Funeral Home mortuary records are completely digitized and available on the UF digital collections. And we are interested in collecting more because the excellent genealogical information that's there, as well as social history and cultural history as well.
Great.
Oh, can I, one more comment, sorry, Jake. I also have a library research guide which provides links to the finding aids and digital collection portals for these collections. And I'm happy to share that with anyone who is interested, and which are publicly accessible, so you can begin to search those if that's something, if you're doing genealogical work. That is a resource. Yes, I can put my email address back up if you like.
Okay. Next question or comment?
This is for Dr. Ortiz. First, my name is Rick Stevenson, visiting professor. My research entails the Middle Passage. I do work on suicide by drowning as a form of resistance, and I do underwater research on sunken slave ships. But I'm teaching a course on the voices of the civil rights movement, and I talked to Dr. Ortiz about some of his oral history, and he introduced me to the Ocala Hunting and Fishing Club and the Black Dot Gang. And these groups were armed self-defense organizations that don't make it into the textbooks. And so I want to just encourage us to use more. I had to rewrite my entire 16 weeks of courses because of that information, but it was amazing to be able to allow students to hear about organizations that are not in a textbook. So oral history is just an amazing way of doing it here, and we have a great repertoire of information here.
Great.
Oh, there was one behind you.
I wanted to commend all the oral history work that's here. I'm aware of a lot of it. I think it's great. One of the things that I was impressed with at a conference I attended a couple of weeks ago was the fact that they were finding the graves that have been built over. You know, Tampa, a great part of Tampa is over graves. I don't know what's in Alachua County, but I wondered if that was something that somebody was looking at. Thank you.
Did you raise
Any
your hand,
response?
Tricia? I thought you put your hand up.
Oh, you go. Did you have something? I guess the only person that I know who's actually looking into that is Karen Kirkman. She was a part of the.
Hold up, yeah.
Okay. Karen Kirkman was actually looking into that. I know she was a part of the team that was looking into the graves that were covered up in Tampa. She's a part of the Hale Homestead docent there. Yeah.
We have some local historians here.
Okay.
Yeah, they're talking about Karen Kirkman, who I guess she's the director, Melanie, of the historic Hale Homestead, which they have a nice exhibit up right now about black people were enslaved on those properties, and that's down on Archer Road. And she's worked very closely with several people, including Jim Powell, who is at the Alachua County Archives. And for many of the cemeteries, you can actually sit at home, get on your laptop, and Google certain cemeteries, and he's actually gone out and photographed graves, the headstones, and you can look it up, and any descriptions, you can see a picture. Now, what we're realizing now is I'm working with one of the cemeteries, the Patterson Community Cemetery in Arredondo, is that now it's time to do it again because, they did that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and there's some people who don't know about cemetery care. So when you go to cut the grass, you can't just, run over everything because you're going to mess up the headstone. So a lot of it has to do with talking to communities about preserving those small cemeteries. There are cemeteries on people's private property where people know there's a cemetery there, but they'll still build on or around the cemeteries. And I know of several cases here of families who have tried to get access to their family cemeteries where somebody lives there now. So it's important for us to document that and make that information available to people in the communities, because a lot of times people don't even know that their family's headstone is online. But just to the question, somebody was specifically asking about building on top of that. There have been cases where developers have built on top of things, and I think that what they do is they'll say, after what they did down in, I guess, St. Pete, where they just uncovered those graves, years later, 50 years later, they'll say, oops, we didn't know anything was there, when in fact they knew it was there when they built it. But it's, I guess, after everything's built, then they'll come back later and say, oh, sorry, we did that. But we do have a few cases like that here. But people are still working on that. And that's why we're trying to preserve these cemeteries, because what they'll do is they'll move the property line, basically. And so when you do oral history, that's why this work is so important, you will talk to people and they'll say, well, that cemetery used to extend about, 50 feet that way, but so I don't know why the fence is here now. And you will actually see some headstones out there. And so it becomes very important to get those stories and take pictures while you still can and while there's still people alive who can tell you where those spots were. Because people, they will work together. Sometimes people in government will work with people who are developers and the lawyers, and before you know it, your land is gone. So.
Yep.
Hello, I'd love to hear from some of our young folks here. Come on,
Put them
people.
on the spot.
I got you. Say
That's
something.
stressful. That's stressful. The Socratic method? No. They're like, we encourage.
I don't have a question or a comment. I just want to thank you all for this opportunity to be here today and providing this to students. It's very informative, and I just wanted to say thank you.
And I do want to tell these young people, the field of African American studies is a great field of studies. A lot of research universities are offering PhD programs in African American studies. From Harvard to Temple, UMass last year produced 9 PhDs 1 year in African American studies. So we're thinking about your career, young people, think about African American studies.
So many of the panelists had talked about the connection of African American studies to struggle. And I'd like to know if anyone in the panel can address what the significance of the history of struggle at San Francisco State University and Cornell University insofar as the founding of African American studies is concerned, and any relationship to what happened here in the 1960s.
Somebody take over. If you don't, I will. All right, where they are wrestling.
I know.
Go ahead.
Well, I can just talk, personally, the colleagues, students, the struggle at San Francisco State University, which eventually creates an ethnic studies college where you have Chicano studies, African American studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies. The leaders of that struggle, and again, students, it's very important to understand that in the 60s, the people who create ethnic studies, African American studies, black studies, are high school students, they're college students, they're faculty, but in many cases, in the prelude to the creation of ethnic studies in San Francisco State were the Chicano, what we used to call what we still call the Chicano blowouts. That is the mass walkout of Chicano high school students in Los Angeles, but all up and down the West Coast, who walked out of their high school classes to demand not the right to take a day off, they demanded the right to read more, to study more. What they wanted to read more was Chicano, Mexican American, Latino history. And it was very closely connected to walkouts by African American students. And so those walkouts, and then some of the high school students who walked out in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland, a few years later become college students. And they end up at San Francisco State, and now they're demanding a college curriculum. They're demanding the right to take bachelor's degree level courses. And then kind of the next step behind that, in some ways, is the PhD programs. Now, I'm not familiar about San Francisco, the connections between SF State. That's probably something Dr. Horn can tell us. But the last thing I also wanted to mention about that was the importance of the coastal connections and the importance of the civil rights movement again, because many of the activists who sat in, who picketed, who helped create ethnic studies at San Francisco State, which is really, in many cases, the mother program, were again civil rights movement activists. They came directly from working in Freedom Summer in Mississippi, in the Arkansas Delta. They were women active in the women's movement and the anti-war movement. So again, the connection between organizing civil rights protests and bringing that perspective to the academy.
Thank you. And I am going to call him. He said he just wanted to listen today, but I am going to ask him to say just a little bit of something in just a minute, because he is living, and I'm talking about Dr. Horn, because he is a professor of African American study. He helped found our program, and he is in California. But I would just say that I'm glad you mentioned that the piece about struggle. And so, yes, it was this collaborative struggle, and it's interesting, Dr. Ortiz uses that term Chicano, right? Which, in this context, you don't hear about Chicanos a lot here in Florida, but it's a distinct group of people and other people from different communities who collaborated, where you had this campus community connection. And at San Francisco State, it was a very organized effort. My family had actually moved to San Francisco. My father was at San Francisco State right after, so I was actually a baby. So don't you all talk about I was a little girl anyway. And it was a thriving community because you had the Black Panthers, you had Angela Davis, you had all of the lectures, you had all of the activism, and people were excited about the fact that this program had been started, but it was rooted first and foremost in the community. And so when Nathan Hare became the first director of African American Studies, he was coming from Howard University. And so what you're coming, it's from the West Coast to the East Coast to the North to the South, wherever you had these students, they were working together to do the same thing with success to a greater or lesser degree. Administrations were trying to think of ways to accommodate the students in some cases, but in most cases they were met with resistance. And in many cases when they did establish these programs, it was a challenge. So people were placed in little tiny spaces. And so it was significant when we moved here, we moved into our new office space in 1012, Turlington Hall, and I got a little emotional because I remember having many conversations with Dr. Foreman, who, when I first met him, he was sitting in an office space where I could almost touch him from the hallway. But he did the best he could within those confines. But this was the case throughout the country. And so that's why we always include that phrase, that struggle was a part of it. So it's always nice now to see what we have, but we can't forget these many challenges that people had to go through, and in many cases still go through, because in some places they are eliminating so-called ethnic studies programs and Black studies programs. So I'm going to add and then let Dr. Horn.
And I think I'll pass it on. It's also helpful to understand that our students are still, it's not a utopia, right? And our students are still quite isolated and struggling. And if you want to pay attention to what's happening globally, there are students in Syracuse who just yesterday got suspended for fighting for the right to be on a campus and not be violated. And so we can't, yay, but also we have to also pay attention to what's happening to our students and to find ways to support them, because they're on the front line for us at this point, right? We need to find ways to support them. So if you don't know about Syracuse, just look it up. It's not pretty, right?
And so Dr. Horn, because he was a student, and I'm just always impressed that it was the students. This grew out of a student effort here at University of Florida, and so he can tell us who influenced him.
We experienced the same thing at the University of Kansas. If you want to read about that, I went there 70 when Dr. Foreman was here. It was established by the BSU. If you want to read that, it's in my memoir. It's called Double Heritage. It's a part of the exhibit here. That's the story of Kansas. It's about the same story all over. Like Cornell, the same struggle. Okay, brother. You have a question?
Good afternoon. We were influenced by the NAACP youth organization and SNCC. SNCC was the premier youth organization for Black activism. When we set up the African American Association, we were trying to get Adam Clayton Powell to come here and speak. based on what we learned from SNCC. SNCC was the prime engine for setting up black student organizations all over the country. So in terms of activism, everything we did came out of learning what they had done before.
Thank you. One more question so we can close, because our lunch is here.
My question is for Dr. Celeste.
Yes.
You mentioned radical love and radical black love. I'm trying to see how to formulate this question. I was recently engaged in a conversation about the absence of love songs in popular culture, particularly hip hop. If you listen to any urban hip hop station, they're having this discussion about there aren't any love songs. So either black folks have stopped singing about love, or there's a reason for it. So can you tell me if there's a connection to that, and what do you mean by black love, or black radical love, or radical love in particular?
Thank you for the question. So I study media, so I enjoy your question. So this is not my term. I'm borrowing from other scholars who've written about this, including Bell Hooks. And so last week, our whole class was about love. There was a quiz too, though. And so part of what I'm talking about is thinking about love as a decision, love as an action, love as communal. I think a part of what happens in our culture is that there's different phases in music that becomes popular, right? So we're in the current, like, let's go to the club, make money, and dance. What's happening in the music now is really reflective of what the priorities tend to be, which is about the acquisition of wealth, right? Social mobility, and so yeah. So I mean, I think a part of I'm trying to not go too hard because I don't know who's in the room. So a part of let's do it. Okay. So if we talk about power structures, right? Most of us are existing in societies that are not designed by us, and so this idea of hegemony is that we all consent to participate in our own oppression, whether we know it or not. And so what becomes popular in music, on television, is sort of the dominant culture, in this case mainstream, white, upper class, middle class, heterosexual, there's a whole list of sort of the dominant groups. And so those are the priorities that we have to engage with every day. And there was a time period where music genres like hip hop were actually about love, right? They were about how do we challenge poverty? How do we challenge social inequality? How do we challenge the fact that governments are paying companies to leave the country, right? So globalization was being critiqued by hip hop. So hip hop itself as a genre, and not how we know it now, was an act of love, right? It was an act of resistance. And what we hear in the radio has been filtered through a lot of old white rich dudes, right? And that's who, can I say all that? And that's, I already said it. And these are sort of the people who have created these narratives for us. And so there are ways in which to still connect to ourselves through music, but it's not gonna be the music you hear on the radio, because by the time it gets to you on the radio, it's already been filtered through sort of hegemonic ideas of who we are and who we're supposed to be. And so when I talk about love, it's a love that is extracted from capitalism, right? It's extracted from this idea that you can't love someone who is of the same gender, right? Or that you can't love someone. This idea of love is really quite powerful. And a part of, I think, of what's happened in pop culture is Black people have been told that we don't love each other, or that we are not lovable, or that we are not capable of loving. And none of that comes from us. That all comes from sort of broader hegemonic structures. And so when I talk about self-love, it's about a reclamation of the fact that we ourselves are enough, right? And when I talk about self-love in the context of community, it's that we recognize that people who are in our communities who don't look like us, don't have the same money as us, don't speak the same language as us, are also enough and worthy of our care and attention. So this idea of radical self-love is a rejection of racism, of capitalism, of sexism, of homophobia, right? It's I see you, you are me, how can we survive together? Versus like slap some hoes in the club, right? So it's a very different experience of culture and popular culture and music.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to give the...
I did.
I'm trying to give the sister some body language so we can, please don't hold it against me. I know I see many other hands. I got to come to closure now because our lunch is here. Dr. Harry Shaw, he's going to give us some closing remarks. Dr. Shaw came to University of Florida in 1973, was one of the early scholars in English department. He retired as Emeritus professor. He's published a couple of books. I love his work on Gwendolyn Brooks, who's a native of Kansas. That's why I like it. And he was associate dean of the college before he became even class. So, Dr. Shaw, it's all yours.
Thank you much. First of all, I want to thank the Dean Russell and the library staff for making this facility available. It's just tremendous. Thank you so much. I also want to thank what a great resource this panel is. And I want to thank the panel for its contribution. Now, you heard several people kid about the fact that there would be a quiz afterwards. I feel that I'm the only one who has to take a test now because I had to take notes on what people were saying, and I have to make comments. One of the things that I noticed running through all of the panelists' themes was the idea of struggle. You know, it was the great Fred Douglass who said that without struggle, there is no progress. Yeah. And that power concedes nothing without a demand. And what we see time and again from these panelists is that there were struggles. There were demands. Indeed, those struggles and demands, as we see from the panelists, is what gave birth to the African American Studies program here at the University of Florida and around the country. Now, one could ask the question, I know the point was made that the University of Florida has more majors than any other African American Studies program or department in the country. This is a big country. This is a country that has many prestigious universities. What is so special about the University of Florida? I think you got a taste of it by listening to this panel. What a resource. Indeed, indeed, indeed. Looking again from the beginning at the resources that were evident in the African American Studies program and now in the African American Studies department were the people, the leaderships and the faculty, and indeed the students in those programs. And we see it reflected here. I heard more than once that I took so many notes that it's hard for me to find that in addition to it being a struggle, that it is also a repository. Again and again, we've heard that African American Studies is a repository, whether it's written, oral, or digital. And indeed, I was so impressed with what this library has. The library has what is going to be, what is considered a gold mine And it also helps to explain why this African American Studies program has done so well. I think that we just have to look forward to a great future based on the comments and the contributions of this panel. One of the things I like best is the fact that the African American Studies program, as was pointed out here by all the panelists, is so well connected, and I think it's reflected here, with the community, the African American community. So we look forward to a continuation going into this next 50 years of the African American Studies program here at the University of Florida, and hoping that with these great resources that the future will be bright and that we'll continue to go forward. Thank you much.
We are now adjourned, and we will see you. Just keep our discussion going on. And any announcements, Mr. Chair?